If you are holding tea, wine, or emotional stability, set it down. This is the story of how a wealthy merchant died mid-lecture about cinnamon futures. A stepmother committed what can only be described as financial arson with plausible deniability. An Omega inherited debt, 3 chairs, and a personality disorder labeled entrepreneurial. And a king, a whole king, got traded for goats. 5 goats, not 6, not even an even number. 5. And if you are also currently holding a suspiciously sweet beverage, put it down. I am not legally responsible for spit takes, emotional wheezing, or the very real possibility that you are about to witness the most financially disrespectful inheritance situation in recent pack history. Also, before we begin, go ahead and subscribe, because what happened to Zimriel Thistledoom did not stop at one bad decision. Oh no, it escalated. Violently. But first, we must discuss the day everything went catastrophically sideways. The late merchant lord Tharveth Thistledoom did not die quietly. He did not die peacefully. He did not even have the basic courtesy to die in a way that would allow his accountants to finish the quarterly reports. Number Tharveth Thistledoom, trader of rare spices, collector of questionable investments, and a man who believed moderation was for cowards, died exactly the way he lived, dramatically, expensively, and with witnesses. One moment he was in his study, loudly explaining the global importance of cinnamon futures, and the next, boom! Down he went, right onto the imported velvet carpet. Face first, with the kind of theatrical commitment that would have earned applause under different circumstances. The physician was called. The servants were summoned. The neighbors began hovering with professional levels of curiosity. And by sunset, through the official verdict was delivered. Merchant Lord Tharveth Thistledoom had exited the mortal realm, permanently. Now, this is the part where most daughters would collapse into delicate, heartbroken grief. Zimriel Thistledoom did cry, deeply, emotionally, with feeling, mostly about the ledgers, because while the household was still busy wailing dramatically in the front hall, her stepmother, Lady Velistra, the financially predatory, was already in the study, looting, with efficiency, or with purpose, with the cold focus of a woman who had absolutely never lost a board game in her life. By morning, the estate looked less like the home of a once obscenely wealthy merchant, and more like the aftermath of a very polite burglary. Documents? Gone. Jewels? Gone. Emergency gold reserves hidden behind the 3rd wine rack? Painfully gone. Trust is nice. Documentation is nicer. Unfortunately, Zimriel had neither. By the time the funeral arrived, or the situation had deteriorated from unfortunate to legally suspicious. Her stepmother wept loudly in public. Her stepsisters sniffled with theatrical commitment. And Zimriel stood beside the coffin in black, dabbing her eyes and quietly doing mental math, because something was not adding up. At all. In fact, if her calculations were correct, the Thistledoom fortune had just performed a full disappearing act, with choreography, and possibly backup dancers. After the burial, Lady Velistra delivered the news with the soft, sympathetic tone of someone who absolutely did not mean a single word she was saying. "Oh, darling," she sighed, already halfway packed for another kingdom. "Your father's unfortunate business complications have left us with very little liquidity." Zimriel blinked slowly. Once. Twice. Internally, several alarms began ringing. Externally, she smiled the slightly feral smile of a woman whose survival instincts were waking up from a long nap. Or because here was the thing. Zimriel Thistledoom was many things. Carefree, unsupervised, occasionally in violation of common sense. But stupid? Absolutely not. Within a week, the stepfamily vanished. new kingdom, new estate, new suspiciously well-funded lifestyle. And Zimriel? Zimriel was left behind in her father's once grand house with 3.5 functional chairs, a pantry containing mostly emotional disappointment, and bills stacked high enough to qualify as architecture. She stood in the middle of the echoing foyer, hands on hips, staring at the mathematical tragedy of her new life. Silence filled the house, long, heavy, judgmental. Then Zimriel inhaled slowly and made a decision that would later concern multiple authority figures. Rule 1. Attachment is suspicious. Rule 2. If you don't laugh, you will scream, and screaming is terrible for the throat. Rule 3. Life is short. Eat the expensive bread first. She dusted off her skirts, or kicked a bill pile out of her walking path, and grinned. Bright, reckless, a little bit unhinged. Because if the world was going to play dirty, Zimriel Thistledoom was about to become professionally difficult. The pack would later call her many things. The unsupervised Omega, walking consequence generator. The girl who once tried to haggle with tax collectors and almost won. But on that quiet afternoon, standing in the wreckage of her inheritance, Zimriel only had one very practical thought. Grief is temporary, she muttered, grabbing the last decent loaf of bread from the kitchen. A pause. A bite. Then, cheerfully, debt collectors are forever. Unfortunately for the entire kingdom, this was only the beginning. Meanwhile, in the frost-polished capital of Dravenholm, where the banners were always straight and the politics were rarely legal, the Alpha King Valthorian Grimvaunt was having what history would later classify as a very inconvenient morning. It began, as many disasters do, with his mother smiling. Not a warm smile, not a loving smile. No. This was the slow, knowing smile of a woman who had raised a son, survived court politics, and was about to introduce both of those problems to each other. Valthorian noticed immediately. Because Valthorian Grimvaunt noticed everything. He noticed crooked curtains, uneven armor displays, and breathing that sounded suspiciously unregulated. Control was not just a preference, it was a lifestyle. So when the Queen summoned him to the private solar and sat there looking entirely too pleased with herself, his eye twitched, internally, discreetly, like a professional. "Mother," Valthorian said carefully, the word carrying the weight of a man already bracing for nonsense. "Why do you look like that?" The Queen folded her hands, serene, patient, dangerous. "My son," she said sweetly, "do you recall the merchant house of Thistledoom?" Valthorian frowned slightly, already suspicious. "I recall," he said slowly, "that they were profitable." Pause. Why? And that, right there, was the moment the morning died. Because the Queen leaned forward just a fraction and delivered the sentence that would haunt Valthorian's peace of mind for weeks. "You are betrothed to his daughter." Silence. Long, heavy, judgmental. Valthorian Grimvaunt did not panic, but he simply experienced aggressive strategic concern. His spine straightened, his jaw tightened. Somewhere deep in his soul, a perfectly organized schedule burst into flames. "I beg your pardon," he said with terrifying calm. The Queen smiled wider. Oh, she was enjoying this, immensely. "The arrangement was made years ago," she continued smoothly, "before the merchant's unfortunate passing." Valthorian stared at her like a man trying very hard not to develop new trust issues. "And with respect," he said, voice clipped with royal restraint, "you cannot possibly expect me to marry a woman I have never met." One finger lifted. Reason number 1. I do not know her temperament. Second finger. I do not know her loyalties. Third finger. I do not know if she is... He paused, visibly choosing diplomacy over honesty. Profoundly embarrassing. Across the room, sprawled with the relaxed posture of a man who had no personal stake in this disaster. Ezekiel Vorn silently leaned back in his chair and mentally prepared popcorn. Because this was about to be entertaining. Ezekiel had the face of a man who loved disaster, as long as it was happening to someone else. Valthorian was not finished. Oh no, he was just getting warmed up. She could be reckless. Finger 4. Irrational. Finger 5. Financially irresponsible. Finger 6. Socially unpredictable. Finger 7. Emotionally volatile. Finger 8. Or worse. He paused. The room held its breath. Valthorian's voice dropped to a grave, horrified murmur. Impractical. Ezekiel made a small, choking sound and quickly disguised it as a cough. The Queen, however, looked completely unmoved. In fact, she looked amused, which, historically speaking, was never a good sign for Valthorian's blood pressure. "My son," she said gently, "you are making assumptions." "I am making risk assessments," Valthorian corrected immediately, and the Queen waved a delicate hand. "Then assess properly." A beat. Then the verbal knife slid in clean and precise. "Go meet her." Silence detonated in the room. Ezekiel stopped pretending to cough. Valthorian stared. Long. Hard. Like a man calculating whether exile was still on the table. "You want me," he said slowly, "to personally travel across the kingdom, to evaluate a stranger." The Queen's smile did not move. "Yes." His eye twitched again, this time with feeling. For Valthorian Grimvaunt was many things, disciplined, strategic, dangerously composed. But he was also, unfortunately, the proud son of an even more stubborn woman. And pride was a chronic condition. Minutes later, he exhaled slowly through his nose, the sound of a man accepting his fate. "Fine." Ezekiel straightened immediately. Oh, this was getting good. Valthorian's voice turned cold and precise, the tone he used when preparing for situations he already expected to regret. "So we go quietly," he said. "No royal escort. No fanfare. No advance warning." Ezekiel's grin spread slowly. Ah, an undercover mission, his favorite genre of poor decision. Valthorian adjusted his cuffs with lethal calm. "If I am to evaluate this arrangement," he continued, "I will do so without interference." The Queen's eyes gleamed. Hook, line, royal sinker. Then, but finally, and with the exhausted resignation of a man who would absolutely blame himself later, Valthorian muttered, "I have made worse decisions. Probably." Across the room, Ezekiel Vorn smiled the peaceful smile of a man who had just front-row seats to someone else's impending downfall. Somewhere, many miles away, Zimriel Thistledoom was about to become a problem, a loud one, and Valthorian Grimvaunt, king, alpha, professional control enthusiast, was walking directly toward it. But voluntarily, like a man with absolutely no survival instincts. Poor soul. By the time the sun crawled over the crooked rooftops of Velcrath Hollow, the market district was already awake. Stalls rattled open. Vendors shouted prices with the desperate confidence of people who absolutely intended to overcharge someone before noon. And in the middle of it all was a problem. Specifically, Zimriel Thistledoom, unsupervised, unbothered, and currently negotiating like the economy had personally offended her. "You're charging me triple," Zimriel said pleasantly, hands folded behind her back as she leaned over the spice stall like a general inspecting enemy territory. The vendor, a large man with the sweat of poor decisions already forming at his temples, forced a smile. "Miss, that is the standard." "Sir," Zimriel cut in gently, "I have seen your standard. Your standard is emotionally unstable." A nearby customer choked, and the vendor blinked. Once, twice. What? Zimriel leaned closer. Confidential. Calm. Mildly threatening. If I buy in bulk, you lower the price. If you lower the price, I return next week. If I return next week, you develop long-term customer stability. She smiled sweetly. If you don't, I tell everyone your cinnamon tastes like regret. Silence. Heavy. Economically devastating. The vendor folded in under 7 seconds. Somewhere nearby, as a woman whispered reverently, "That girl negotiates like she has no fear of consequences." She did not. This was the problem. Zimriel believed in 3 things: good bread, fast exits, and not asking follow-up questions. Life was much calmer that way, less emotionally complicated, less likely to involve betrayal, financial ruin, or stepmothers with suspicious travel plans. She paid for her discounted spices, tucked them neatly into her basket, and turned, just in time to hear Mrs. the Pelvra from next door sigh the long, suffering sigh of a woman who had witnessed too much. "You're causing problems again, aren't you?" Zimriel beamed. "I prefer the term stimulating the local economy." Mrs. Pelvra pinched the bridge of her nose. "You haggled a fishmonger into tears last week. He was emotionally unprepared. You reorganized the butcher's pricing board. He thanked me later. You are banned from 3 separate bakeries." Zimriel paused. In my defense, but that was only partially my fault. Mrs. Pelvra stared at her the way one stares at incoming weather disasters. Velcrath Hollow, as a community, was tired. So very tired. Which is why, later that afternoon, when 2 unfamiliar men approached the slightly crumbling Thistledoom estate, the neighborhood collectively leaned toward the windows, because new people meant one thing: entertainment. But Velthorian Grimvaunt stepped through the front gate with the controlled posture of a man who preferred his environments orderly and his interactions predictable. Unfortunately for him, he had arrived at the wrong address. Behind him, Rezekiel Vorn was already scanning the property with growing delight. "Oh," Rezekiel murmured under his breath, "this feels promising." Velthorian ignored him. Professionally. With effort. Then the front door opened. Zimriel Thistledoom stood in the doorway, her sleeves rolled, hair slightly wind-tangled, and holding what appeared to be half a loaf of aggressively bitten bread. She looked at Velthorian. Long. Slow. Assessing. Her head tilted. 1 degree. 2. 3. And then... She sighed. Deeply. Like a woman who had just opened a package and found the contents mildly disappointing. She looked at him like a mildly disappointing melon. Velthorian froze. Because Velthorian Grimvaunt had been disrespected before. Never. Recreationally. Yes? Zimriel said, still studying him with inappropriate calm. Velthorian drew himself up slightly, every inch the composed, controlled, absolutely not here to be judged alpha male. "We are here regarding the Thistledoom marriage arrangement." A beat. Zimriel blinked. "Oh." Another beat. "Right. That." She took another bite of bread, chewed, swallowed, then shrugged with the relaxed energy of someone agreeing to slightly inconvenient lunch plans. "Sure." Velthorian's brain stalled. "Sure?" She waved a hand vaguely. "I mean, my father set it up, didn't he? If it keeps his ghost from hovering judgmentally over my life choices, I'm willing." Rezekiel made a small, strangled noise behind him. Velthorian did not move. Because something inside his highly organized mental structure had just slipped. "You," he said slowly, carefully, dangerously calm, "when are agreeing to a lifetime political marriage." "Yes." "With a man you have just met." "Yes." "With no further questions." Zimriel smiled brightly. "You're very observant." Velthorian stared at her. She stared back. Unbothered. radiating the deeply concerning energy of a woman who treated major life decisions like optional side quests. And for the first time in years, Valthorian Grimvaunt felt the faint, unwelcome spark of something dangerously close to irritation. Oh, and this was going to be a problem, a loud one. And unfortunately for his peace of mind, he had just volunteered. Valthorian Grimvaunt had handled war councils with less tension than this sitting room. He stood near the window, posture perfect, expression carved from expensive irritation, while across from him, sprawled in a chair she absolutely did not deserve to look that comfortable in, sat Zimriel Thistledoom. Eating. Still eating. Had she been eating this entire time? Yes. Yes, she had. Rezekiel, meanwhile, had quietly relocated to the corner, like a man who understood history was about to embarrass someone important. He was already keeping score. Emotionally. Valthorian folded his hands behind his back. Composed. Measured. Alpha. Miss Thistledoom, he began, voice smooth with controlled authority. I would like to understand your decision-making process. Zimriel perked up slightly. Oh, that's easy. I mostly go by vibes and available carbohydrates. Rezekiel made a choking sound that he disguised by aggressively studying the ceiling. Scoreboard, Omega, 1. King, emotionally destabilized. Valthorian's eye twitched, subtly, dangerously. I see, he said in the tone of a man who absolutely did not see. And it does not concern you that this arrangement carries significant weight? Zimriel considered this while reaching for another piece of bread. Important pause. Critical chewing. And then, is the weight edible? Silence. The room itself seemed to reconsider its life choices. Valthorian took one slow breath through his nose. In. Out. The measured breathing of a man fighting for his remaining sanity. Do you, he asked carefully, take anything seriously? Zimriel swallowed her bite, sat up straighter, and nodded with grave sincerity. Yes. Hope flickered. Brief. Fragile. Then she added brightly, snack portions. Across the room, Rezekiel turned away so fast he nearly injured his neck. Scoreboard update, Omega, 2. King, developing spiritual hypertension. Valthorian's patience, already hanging by a thread woven from pure stubbornness, began to fray, noticeably. You are remarkably casual, he said, voice cooling several degrees, for someone discussing a binding political alliance. Zimriel tilted her head. You're remarkably tense for someone who voluntarily walked into my living room. Pause. Beat. Impact. Where this conversation was now legally classified as a mutual threat. Valthorian stepped closer. Not aggressive, not loud, just controlled enough to make lesser people reconsider their life decisions. Unfortunately, Zimriel Thistledoom was not lesser people. You misunderstand me, he said quietly. I am attempting to determine whether you grasp the seriousness of what you are agreeing to. Zimriel leaned forward too, not intimidated, not cautious, curious, like she'd just spotted an interesting bug. I understand perfectly, she said. Valthorian waited, suspicious. Zimriel smiled. You're worried I might embarrass you. Rezekiel's shoulders began shaking, violently. Valthorian stiffened. Because, annoyingly, she was not entirely wrong. I am concerned, he said with icy precision, about compatibility. Zimriel brightened. Oh, good news. He did not like that tone. What good news? She gestured lazily between them. You're tall. I'm adaptable. Statistically, we'll figure something out. Rezekiel turned fully towards the wall now. For privacy, for dignity, for the preservation of his lungs. Scoreboard update. Omega, 3. King, questioning his life trajectory. Valthorian stared at her. Long, hard, trying and failing to categorize what exactly he was dealing with. Because she wasn't nervous, wasn't impressed, wasn't even particularly invested. She was just unbothered, dangerously, consistently unbothered. And Valthorian Grimvaunt, who had spent his entire adult life being treated with appropriate levels of caution, felt something deeply unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not anger, not quite. Something sharper, more irritating, more interesting. He did not like it. Zimriel popped the last piece of bread into her mouth and dusted her hands together with satisfaction. "So," she said cheerfully, "are we done being intimidating, or do you have more dramatic staring scheduled?" Behind him, Rezekiel pressed a fist to his mouth. Internally, oh, this is going to ruin him. Valthorian straightened slowly, very slowly, the posture of a man regrouping, recalculating, and very much not prepared for how complicated this situation was becoming. Because one thing was becoming painfully clear. Zimriel Thistledoom was not overwhelmed, not impressed, and worst of all, not afraid of him. Valthorian Grimvaunt had entered this house expecting compliance, but what he was getting instead was opposition. Cheerful, unhinged, snack-motivated opposition, and somewhere deep in his extremely well-regulated instincts. Interest flickered. Brief, unwelcome, dangerous. He was absolutely going to regret this. Soon. Valthorian Grimvaunt woke to silence. Not peaceful silence. Not restful silence. Number. This was the kind of silence that crept into a room, sat down uninvited, and started filing paperwork labeled impending problems. His eyes opened slowly, and automatically alert. Because Valthorian was not a man who trusted quiet mornings. Quiet mornings had a history of betraying him. For a long moment, he lay still in the guest chamber of the Thistledoom estate, listening. No clattering dishes, no aggressive bargaining from the kitchen, no suspiciously cheerful humming from the hallway. Just nothing. Valthorian frowned slightly. Because in the last 48 hours, he had learned one very important fact about Zimriel Thistledoom. If she was awake, there was usually noise. Concerning noise, economically threatening noise, possibly illegal noise. He sat up slowly, carefully. Like a man approaching a trap he was 90% sure had already been triggered. And, against his better judgment, a dangerous thought slipped in. Maybe, just maybe. She had matured overnight. Hope is a dangerous emotion. Valthorian was about to learn this personally. Across the room, Rezekiel Vorn was already awake, already dressed, already looking like a man who had spiritually aged 3 years in the last 2 days. He glanced up as Valthorian rose. "Well," Rezekiel said dryly, "you're alive? Promising start." Valthorian ignored him. Professionally, with experience. "Have you seen her this morning?" he asked. Rezekiel leaned back in the chair near the window, rubbing his face slowly. "No," he said. A beat. Then, but with deep foreboding. "And that worries me." Valthorian moved towards the window, pushed the curtain aside, looked out over the quiet street. Still nothing. No chaotic omega, no suspicious activity, no visible property damage. His frown deepened. Because this was unnatural. For one brief, deeply regrettable moment, Valthorian allowed himself optimism. Perhaps she had finally decided to behave with appropriate restraint. Perhaps she had recognized the seriousness of their arrangement. Perhaps... In the distance, a goat screamed. Valthorian froze. Rezekiel slowly lowered his hands from his face. They both listened. Another goat bleated, loud, aggressive, emotionally invested. Valthorian's jaw tightened. "Tell me," he said slowly, "that Velkrath Hollow simply has a vibrant agricultural sector." Rezekiel did not answer immediately, because unfortunately, the goats sounded organized. The third bleat echoed down the road, followed by shouting, followed by what was unmistakably the sound of hooves hitting cobblestone with deeply committed energy. Rezekiel stood very still, then very slowly turned toward the door. His expression had gone calm. Too calm. The calm of a man preparing to emotionally detach from the next 5 minutes. Rezekiel had the expression of a man updating his will. Valthorian moved first. Long strides, controlled, purposeful. Every instinct in his body now fully awake and deeply suspicious. And because one thing had become painfully clear in the last 2 days. If Zimriel Thistledoom was involved, peace was never part of the plan. They stepped into the front corridor. The noise outside grew louder, closer. Hooves, voices, and... was that cheerful humming? Valthorian stopped walking. Very slowly, very deliberately, because he knew that sound. He had heard that sound yesterday, right before she emotionally destabilized 3 separate conversations. Rezekiel leaned slightly toward him and murmured, with the solemn tone of a man witnessing history unfold, "If that's what I think it is." Valthorian did not respond, because the front gate had just come into view through the open doorway, and something was definitely approaching the house, loudly, confidently, and with entirely too many legs. Valthorian Grimvaunt did not yet know what fresh disaster awaited him outside, but somewhere deep in his highly organized instincts, a single, but terrible realization began to form. This morning was about to get worse, much worse, and unfortunately for his remaining dignity, Zimriel Thistledoom sounded very pleased with herself. Poor man. The front gate burst open with the energy of a situation that had already gotten out of hand. Valthorian stepped onto the front path and stopped, completely, emotionally, existentially. But because marching up the road like she personally owned both the street and the concept of consequences was Zimriel Thistledoom, smiling, radiant, wildly pleased with herself. And behind her, 5 goats. Not calm goats, not polite goats, oh no. These were aggressive, opinionated, deeply uncooperative goats being dragged forward with the stubborn determination of creatures who had already decided violence was an acceptable hobby. Valthorian blinked once, slowly. Surely this was... No, but this was happening. Behind the goats trudged a farming couple and their wide-eyed daughter, all 3 looking extremely satisfied with their morning's business. Rezekiel leaned slightly closer to Valthorian and whispered with dangerous softness, "I feel like we should start running." Valthorian did not move, because his brain had just encountered an error it could not immediately process. Zimriel spotted them and beamed brighter. "Oh, good," she called cheerfully. "Tut, you're awake," the goats bleated, loudly, supportively. Valthorian's eye twitched, violently. She reached the front path, planted her feet, and with the proud flourish of a woman presenting excellent news, announced, "Good news, you have excellent resale value." Silence. Absolute, devastating. Silence. Valthorian stared at her. Long, hard, like a man trying to decide whether this was a misunderstanding or the beginning of a felony. "Explain," he said at last, voice dangerously calm. Or Zimriel gestured casually behind her. "To be fair, they drive a very hard bargain. But I negotiated responsibly." The lead goat chose that moment to try to eat the hem of Valthorian's cloak. Rezekiel made a strangled noise. The farmer stepped forward, nodding with the satisfied air of a man who believed he had made an excellent purchase. "He looks sturdy," the farmer said approvingly. Pause. Reality cracked. Valthorian turned very slowly toward Rezekiel. His voice dropped to a lethal murmur. "Rezekiel, if you laugh, I will legally disown you." Rezekiel pressed both hands over his mouth so fast it was nearly athletic. His shoulders were shaking, violently, spiritually, catastrophically. Scoreboard, Omega, winning by criminal margins. Zimriel clapped her hands together, completely missing, or completely ignoring, the slow death of Velthorian's remaining patience. "So," she said brightly, "gentle exchange, very fair. Everyone benefits." Velthorian turned back to her with the slow precision of a man approaching the edge of reason. "You," he said carefully, "did what?" Zimriel tilted her head. "I traded efficiently." His eye twitched again, this time with feeling. The farmer's wife stepped forward, already in full logistical mode. "We'll need him packed and ready," she said briskly. "Bakery work starts before noon, and the south field still needs clearing." Velthorian did not breathe, did not blink, and did not, technically speaking, remain emotionally stable. "I am not," he said slowly, "working in your bakery." The smallest goat head-butted his boot, with commitment. The farmer frowned slightly, confused. But the girl said, Zimriel raised a helpful finger. "In my defense," she said cheerfully, "you were being very standable and quiet. It created a strong bargaining position." Rezekiel lost the battle. A sound escaped him. Small, broken, dangerously close to laughter. For Velthorian did not look at him, because if he did, there would be consequences. Public confusion was now escalating. Neighbors were appearing at windows. Doors were opening. Someone down the street had absolutely stopped sweeping to watch this unfold. The goats bleated again. Loud, triumphant. Velthorian Grimvaunt, Alpha King, Apex Authority, man of absolute control, finally understood. Fully. Horrifically. He had been commercially exchanged. For livestock. Zimriel smiled at him. Bright, but helpful, completely unrepentant. "Look on the bright side," she added kindly. "You negotiated above market value." Velthorian's jaw tightened. Once, twice, 3 times, somewhere deep inside his very disciplined soul. Something snapped quietly, cleanly, with paperwork, because one thing was now painfully clear. This was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, not even an accident born of questionable judgment. No, but Zimriel Thistledoom had looked at the Alpha King of Dravenholm, evaluated him, and decided, yes, 5 goats seemed fair. Rezekiel, still fighting for his life in the background, had only one coherent thought left. Oh, he is never recovering from this. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. There are many things Alpha King Velthorian Grimvaunt expected to endure in his lifetime. Political betrayal, border disputes, possibly assassination attempts conducted with more enthusiasm than planning. What he did not expect was to be marched down a dusty country road between 5 deeply judgmental goats and a very determined farming couple. Yet here he was, dignity declining by the minute. "I am going to remind you," Velthorian said with lethal calm, "that this situation is temporary." The farmer, already halfway into assigning him chores, nodded absently. Lift those sacks." Velthorian stared. Long, hard. The sacks did not move. Rezekiel walked beside him, with hands clasped behind his back, wearing the peaceful expression of a man who had emotionally clocked out of responsibility hours ago. "You know," Rezekiel murmured helpfully, "technically speaking, this builds character." Velthorian did not respond, because murder, while tempting, would complicate the political situation. The farm was worse than expected, and Velthorian had expected quite a lot. Flour dust hung in the bakery air like an aggressive fog of humiliation. The ovens roared, and the work tables were covered in dough that looked suspiciously sticky and personally offensive. And the goats, The goats had been relocated to the adjacent pen, where they were watching him, intently, like critics. "Right," the farmer's wife said briskly, clapping her hands. "Start with the flour sacks." Valthorian stepped forward, rolled his shoulders, prepared to demonstrate basic competence. Because really, how difficult could... The sack shifted. Badly. Valthorian adjusted his grip, and the sack shifted more. Then, flour exploded, everywhere, into the air, into his hair, onto his boots, into his last remaining shred of emotional stability. Valthorian had fought in wars. None involved this much flour. Behind him, Rezekiel made the fatal mistake of inhaling at the wrong moment. It came out as a sound, a small one, but deeply treacherous. Scoreboard, Omega, still winning. King, powdered. Valthorian straightened slowly, very slowly, but now lightly dusted in what could only be described as culinary disrespect. "I am aware," he said through his teeth, "that this is beneath my skill set." The farmer's wife handed him another sack. "We all start somewhere, dear." Valthorian's eye twitched so hard it deserved its own medical chart. Across the yard, one of the goats hopped onto the fence, locked eyes with him, and charged the wood with violent enthusiasm. The goat made direct eye contact and chose violence. Valthorian stared back, and because at this point, he respected the commitment. Time passed, badly. By mid-afternoon, 3 sacks had betrayed him, 1 broom had snapped under controlled pressure, and the goats had downgraded their opinion of him from mild curiosity to open disrespect. Valthorian Grimvaunt, apex alpha of Dravenholm, was losing a psychological battle to Livestock. This was not in the strategic brief. And then, because the universe clearly had favorites, Zimriel Thistledoom arrived. Cheerful, or bright-eyed, carrying a small basket like she was here for a pleasant afternoon visit instead of an active humiliation event. "Oh, good," she called, strolling into the yard. "You're still alive." Valthorian turned slowly, flour-dusted, tired, visibly reconsidering several life choices. "You," he said calmly, "have excellent timing." Zimriel beamed. "I try." She circled him once, slowly, assessing. Rezekiel, traitor that he was, but had retreated to the shade where he could safely observe the emotional damage in real time. Zimriel stopped in front of Valthorian and nodded approvingly. "Well," she said, "you haven't been fired yet. That's promising." Valthorian stared at her. Because the truly irritating part, the deeply inconvenient part, was that she didn't look smug, didn't look cruel, didn't even look particularly invested. She just looked amused, bright, curious. "You're doing great," Zimriel added kindly. The Valthorian narrowed his eyes. "For someone emotionally fragile." Rezekiel made a noise that sounded medically concerning. Valthorian exhaled slowly through his nose. Because this woman, this deeply unsupervised Omega, was testing the outer limits of his patience. And yet, annoyingly, dangerously, he was starting to notice things. The way she watched everything. The way she moved like she was always 3 steps ahead of trouble. And the way her eyes sharpened for just a second when she thought no one was looking. Interesting. Highly inconvenient. Deeply suspicious. Zimriel tilted her head, studying him again. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "for someone who looks like he files paperwork for fun, you're surprisingly stubborn." Valthorian met her gaze. Steady, controlled, and just a fraction more engaged than he had been yesterday. "Miss Thistledoom," he said quietly, "you have no idea." Her smile widened. Uh-oh. It's because somewhere between the flower explosions and the goat-based disrespect, something had shifted, not softened, not remotely safe. but shifted. And Valthorian Grimvaunt, against his better judgment, his training, and his extremely organized emotional boundaries, was starting to find Zimriel Thistledoom. Interesting. This was going to age him terribly. By mid-afternoon, Valthorian had reached a groundbreaking personal milestone. He was losing an argument to a sack of flour. It sat there, silently, judgmentally, winning. The bakery-slash-farm hybrid, which Valthorian was beginning to suspect was a personal attack disguised as a workplace, buzzed with cheerful, flour-dusted chaos. Villagers moved in efficient patterns. Bread trays slid in and out of ovens. Someone was singing off-key with alarming confidence. And in the middle of it all, Zimriel, smiling, chatting, thriving. Valthorian narrowed his eyes. This was suspicious behavior. Deeply suspicious. Across the long wooden counter, Zimriel leaned casually toward the supplier, a broad-shouldered merchant who looked like he wrestled grain sacks for recreational stress relief. 40 silver for the wheat shipment, the man said firmly. Zimriel tilted her head, smiled sweetly, and absolutely did not blink. Valthorian, who had negotiated war treaties and once intimidated a duke into apologizing to a chair, felt something deeply unsettling crawl up his spine. Something was about to happen. And he could feel it. 40? Zimriel repeated gently. The merchant nodded. Yes, miss. She hummed, soft, thoughtful, dangerous. Well, she said pleasantly, considering last month's delivery arrived half damp and 3 bags short, I feel 32 is both generous and emotionally forgiving. The merchant froze. Valthorian blinked. Once. Slowly. Oh. Oh no. The merchant cleared his throat. That was a transport issue. Zimriel's smile widened. And my disappointment is a budgeting issue. Rezekiel, standing 3 feet behind Valthorian, made a small choking sound that he immediately disguised as a cough. Poorly. Very poorly. The merchant tried again. 38. Zimriel leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, not rude, just inevitably persuasive. 32, she repeated, and I will also forget the incident where your nephew attempted to flirt with Mrs. Dovewick's prize goose. Silence fell. Heavy. Loaded. Or the merchant stared at her. Horrified. Respectful. Defeated. 32, he muttered. Valthorian felt his worldview tilt 5 degrees to the left. Because unfortunately, inconveniently, deeply offensively, she was competent. Valthorian took this personally. Coins changed hands. Papers were signed. The villagers nearby nodded with the quiet approval of people who had absolutely been expecting this outcome. Traitors. All of them. Zimriel turned and caught Valthorian staring. Her grin sharpened instantly. Well, she said lightly, if it isn't my favorite agricultural hostage. Valthorian folded his arms. Regal. Dusty. Increasingly flower-adjacent. You appear, he said slowly, to have misrepresented your intellectual capacity. Zimriel gasped, offended, dramatic. I am wounded. You negotiated a supplier down 8 silver without raising your voice. She beamed. Charm is just manipulation wearing perfume. Rezekiel, traitor that he was, muttered under his breath. Accurate. Valthorian ignored him with the focus of a man clinging to the last fragments of his dignity. You are, he said carefully, considerably more calculating than you initially presented. Zimriel rocked back on her heels. Pleasant, unbothered, suspiciously pleased. Oh good, she said. You're catching up. Somewhere in the background, a goat screamed. Not randomly, not chaotically, pointedly. Valthorian did not look at it. He had learned. The growth was happening. Against his will. Rezekiel leaned casually against a flour barrel, mentally updating what was very clearly an internal spreadsheet of royal emotional decline. Current estimate: catastrophic but entertaining. His internal betting pool was thriving. Valthorian exhaled slowly through his nose. Studied her. Really studied her this time. Because the problem, the deeply inconvenient, personally offensive problem, was becoming clearer by the second. She wasn't reckless, or she wasn't foolish. She wasn't even particularly chaotic when she chose not to be. Zimriel was strategic, and worse. She was enjoying this. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger, not quite suspicion. Something sharper, more dangerous, more interested than he was emotionally prepared to process. Zimriel noticed immediately. Of course she did. Her smile softened just a fraction. Victory glittering quietly in her eyes. "Well," she said lightly, brushing flour off her hands, "but try not to have a personality crisis about it, Your Agricultural Highness." Valthorian stared at her. Long. Measured. Deeply, deeply unimpressed. "Rezekiel," he said without looking away from her, "how many hours until I reclaim my throne?" Rezekiel didn't even hesitate. "Oh, we passed that window yesterday, Your Majesty." Valthorian's eye twitched. Just once. But history would remember it. The day should have ended quietly. Which, in hindsight, was Valthorian's first mistake. Or because peace, he was learning, was something that actively avoided Zimriel like it owed her money. Late afternoon sunlight spilled through the bakery windows, warm and deceptively calm. Flour dust floated lazily in the air. Bread cooled on racks. The goats, unfortunately still employed by chaos, were momentarily behaving. It was suspicious. Valthorian did not trust it. He stood near the back counter, arms folded, their posture radiating the exhausted dignity of a man who had been personally victimized by agriculture. Across the room, Zimriel was laughing with one of the older village women, sleeves rolled, hair slightly loose from its usual chaos. She looked normal, approachable, dangerously human. Valthorian frowned at the unfamiliar discomfort settling in his chest. This was unacceptable. Rezekiel leaned beside him, voice low. "Or you're staring again." "I am observing. You're emotionally spiraling. I am assessing threats." Rezekiel paused, then, very calmly, "Your Majesty, the threat is currently handing out free bread samples." Valthorian did not dignify that with a response, mostly because it was inconveniently accurate. The bell above the bakery door jingled. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but sharply enough that Valthorian's instincts, finely honed by years of political backstabbing and one extremely aggressive coronation banquet, snapped to attention. 3 women entered, well-dressed, sharp-eyed, and already whispering. Valthorian didn't like whispering. Whispering led to problems. Problems led to paperwork. Zimriel noticed them a half-second later, and froze. It was subtle. So subtle most people would have missed it. But Valthorian had spent years reading battlefields and courtrooms. He saw it immediately. Her shoulders tightened. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And something quick and raw, flickered across her expression before the mask slammed firmly back into place. Ah. There it was. Emotional damage. Suddenly things made sense. The women approached the counter, their voices pitched just loud enough to be accidentally overheard. Professional mistake, or Valthorian was excellent at accidental overhearing. Heard the Steppe family finally returned to the northern estates. After everything that happened, poor thing never did recover properly, did she? The air went very still. Zimriel's hands, which had been confidently wrapping bread moments ago, paused for exactly one heartbeat too long. Valthorian felt it. That tiny shift, like a crack forming in polished glass. Rezekiel's posture straightened slightly beside him. I'm internally updating the situation from comedic chaos to, oh, this just got emotionally interesting. Zimriel turned slowly, smile perfectly in place. Too perfect. Oh, she said lightly, voice bright in that way that screamed, do not look too closely. Can I help you ladies with something carb-related? One of the women blinked. Zimriel, we didn't expect to see you still here. Still here. Not working. Not doing well. Just still here. Valthorian felt something unpleasant settle in his chest. He did not care for it. Feelings were happening. This was deeply unprofessional. Zimriel's smile held, but her eyes had gone very, very careful. Yes, she said cheerfully. Shockingly, I continue to exist. Tragic for my enemies. The women exchanged looks, not kind ones. Your stepmother was asking after you, another said sweetly. Weaponized sweetness. Valthorian recognized the technique immediately, or he had used it on diplomats, and for the first time since he had met her, Zimriel flinched. Small, quick, but real. Valthorian went very still, because the problem, the deeply inconvenient, personally irritating problem, was that it wasn't funny. Not this time. Zimriel recovered fast. Too fast. Her grin snapped back into place like armor being hastily buckled. Well, she chirped, tell her I'm thriving, hydrated, and emotionally unavailable. Rezekiel made a small, impressed noise. But Valthorian was watching her too closely now, and he saw it, the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers curled slightly into the counter's edge, the careful, deliberate brightness of someone very determined not to let anything crack open. Ah, there it was again. Grief, sharp, hidden, still very much alive. Zimriel turned suddenly and caught him looking, really looking, her eyes narrowed instantly, defensive, cornered, dangerous. Don't look at me like that, she warned softly. A beat, but then sharper. I bite when observed. Valthorian should have looked away. A smarter man would have. A more emotionally stable man definitely would have. Unfortunately, Valthorian had never been either of those things. His voice, when it came, was quieter than usual. Not mocking. Not sharp. Just steady. Your step-family, he said carefully, appears to have left an impression. Zimriel went very still. For half a second, the mask slipped. Just enough. And just long enough for something raw and tired and very, very human to show through. Then it was gone. She smiled again. Too bright, too easy, too practiced. Well, she said lightly, turning back to her bread trays. We all have hobbies. Valthorian didn't move, didn't speak, didn't push, but something in his expression shifted. Subtle, dangerous, interested in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with goats or flour or agricultural humiliation. Across the room, Rezekiel watched the moment unfold. Slowly, delighted, deeply, deeply concerned for his king's emotional future. Oh, he thought, this is going to destroy him. Rezekiel gave it exactly 4 minutes. 4. Before he leaned casually against a flour barrel and said, in the tone of a man about to emotionally instigate, So, we're staring now. Valthorian did not look away from Zimriel. I am not staring. You've been not staring for 6 continuous minutes. I am observing. You look like you're trying to solve her with math. Valthorian's jaw tightened. This was not attraction. This was aggressive professional interest. Rezekiel nodded solemnly. Of course. Very professional. Extremely aggressive. Across the bakery, Zimriel was back to business, which, unfortunately, meant she was thriving. But Velthorion watched, against his will and better judgment, as she negotiated with a grain supplier who looked like he had come prepared for battle and was currently losing. Badly. "No, see," Zimriel was saying cheerfully, sliding a ledger across the counter. "Your prices are emotionally upsetting. We're going to fix that." The supplier blinked. "Emotionally?" "Deeply upsetting," she confirmed. "Frankly, my bread deserves better." Velthorion's eye twitched. Unfortunately. She was winning. Efficiently. Brutally. With the relaxed confidence of someone who had absolutely no fear of consequences, and at least 3 backup exit plans. Velthorion exhaled slowly through his nose. This was inconvenient, because the situation was evolving. Rapidly. And he did not like the direction of travel. His wolf, meanwhile, had fully abandoned professionalism. Interested, it purred internally. Velthorion stiffened. Absolutely not. His mental voice was ice cold. "Stand down." And the wolf did not stand down. In fact, it leaned forward metaphorically and made things worse. "She is clever, irrelevant. She is bold, concerning. She insulted you recreationally and survived." Velthorion's eye twitched harder. This was a deeply traitorous line of reasoning. His wolf was traitorous, Velthorion muttered under his breath. He was filing a complaint. Rezekiel, who unfortunately heard everything, made a small, choking noise. "Oh, this is catastrophic," he whispered, where Velthorion shot him a look that promised future paperwork. Across the room, Zimriel finished the negotiation with a bright, devastating smile and a handshake that looked legally binding. The supplier left looking slightly disoriented and financially lighter. The villagers nearby? Beaming. Actually beaming. At her. Velthorion frowned, deeply, suspiciously, because this was new information. "She's popular," Rezekiel murmured, clearly enjoying himself. Velthorion's voice was flat. "I have noticed. This must be very hard for you. I am enduring. You look like you're developing emotions against your will." Velthorion did not dignify that with a response, mostly because it was, once again, inconveniently accurate. Zimriel turned and caught him frowning. Again. Her eyes lit up instantly with dangerous amusement. Oh no, that expression never meant anything good. She strolled over, wiping flour from her hands, the posture entirely too relaxed for someone who had recently caused him psychological distress via Livestock. "You're frowning again," she said pleasantly. A beat. Then, with surgical precision, "Is it your hobby?" Rezekiel physically turned away. Coward. Velthorion straightened slowly to his full, intimidating height, which usually worked. On diplomats, on generals, on people with survival instincts. Zimriel tilted her head and examined him like a mildly disappointing melon. It did not work. "I do not have hobbies," Velthorion said coolly. Zimriel gasped softly. "Oh no." A pause, then, gravely, "That explains so much." Somewhere in the distance, a goat screamed, emotionally. Velthorion leaned slightly closer, voice lowering just enough to carry weight. "You appear," he said carefully, "unreasonably cheerful for someone who recently sold a man into agricultural servitude." Zimriel smiled sweetly. "Correction. Temporarily reassigned. What with growth opportunities?" Rezekiel made a small, strangled noise behind them. Velthorion should have been furious. Logically, strategically, professionally. He was furious. Unfortunately. There was now a secondary problem. Because up close, too close, he could see the fine tension still hiding behind her eyes. The earlier crack. The grief she was pretending didn't exist. And something in his chest did that deeply irritating thing again. Interest. Real interest. Not tactical, not political, but dangerous. His wolf perked up smugly. Valthorion mentally threatened it with exile. Zimriel leaned casually against the counter, completely unaware she was currently the source of his internal constitutional crisis. Or perhaps, horrifying thought, fully aware. Her eyes flicked over him, sharp and assessing. "You're thinking too hard again," she said. Valthorion's voice was smooth. "I am always thinking." She snorted. "That sounds exhausting." The tension between them thickened, noticeably, but visibly, dense enough to weaponize. Rezekiel, watching from the sidelines like a man witnessing a slow-motion carriage crash, quietly updated his internal betting pool. Timeline of royal emotional collapse. Accelerating. Zimriel pushed off the counter. Too close when she moved past him. Too warm. Too easy. Valthorion went very still. His wolf, meanwhile, was having the time of its life. Traitor. Absolute traitor. Zimriel paused at the doorway and glanced back over her shoulder, a grin sharp and entirely too knowing. "Try not to frown yourself into an early grave, your very seriousness." A beat. Then she disappeared into the sunlight. Valthorion stood there, rigid, silent, internally losing a war he had not agreed to fight. Beside him, Rezekiel sighed the long, suffering sigh of a man who had seen this coming from several emotional miles away. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "you are in so much trouble." Valthorion stared at the door she had just walked through, her jaw tight, eyes narrowed, wolf extremely unhelpful. "I am aware," he muttered darkly. But the problem, the deeply catastrophic problem, was that for the first time since this entire disaster began, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to win. The universe, in its infinite commitment to drama, chose the worst possible morning to behave. Which was saying something, because Valthorion Grimvaunt was already having what scholars would later classify as a situation. It began with a messenger, what they always did. The poor man burst into the bakery like someone being chased by deadlines and poor life choices. "Your Majesty!" Silence detonated, complete, immediate, catastrophic. Valthorion froze. Rezekiel's soul left his body, and Zimriel slowly turned. The messenger, bless his deeply doomed heart, finally registered the room. The flower, the goats, the emotional landmines, and most importantly, the extremely not disguised enough Alpha King standing in the middle of it. But the man went pale. "Oh," he whispered. Time stopped, not metaphorically, emotionally, spiritually. Zimriel looked at the messenger, then at Valthorion, then back at the messenger, then back at Valthorion. Her eyes narrowed slowly, dangerously. Oh no. Rezekiel took one careful step backward. Self-preservation was a lifestyle. "You," Zimriel said slowly, too calmly, way too calmly. "Your Majesty." Valthorion closed his eyes briefly. Because yes, but this was exactly how his week had been going. The messenger, still actively ruining lives, dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty, the Council urgently requires—" Valthorion cut him off with the quiet authority of a man who would very much like the earth to open up and help him. "That will be all." The messenger fled. Smart man. Silence returned. Heavy. Loaded. Extremely judgmental. Zimriel stared at him. Long. Hard. Processing at speeds previously thought impossible. Then, her face went blank. But not shocked. Not horrified. Blank. Which was somehow worse. "Oh," she said faintly. A pause. Then she pinched the bridge of her nose. "I traded the Alpha King for goats." Rezekiel turned and walked directly into a wall, on purpose. Zimriel straightened slowly, dignity rebooting in real time. She inhaled. Exhaled. lifted her chin, and delivered with perfect composure. "I would like to formally apologize to your goats." Valthorian stared at her. Flat. Deadpan. Deeply, deeply tired. "And you sold me." Zimriel held up one finger. "In my defense," she said carefully, "you were being very sellable." Somewhere outside, a goat bleated like it had been personally summoned by chaos. Valthorian stepped closer. Slow. Measured. Dangerous. The room temperature dropped approximately 5 degrees. "You," he said quietly, "placed the Alpha King of Dravenholm into agricultural captivity." Zimriel did not retreat, did not flinch, did not, apparently, possess survival instincts, but instead, her eyes sharpened, really sharpened, and for the first time since this entire disaster began, the humor thinned. Just a little. "Correction," she said softly. "You showed up in my house under false identity, insulted my lifestyle, criticized my snacks, and glared at my furniture." A beat. Then, "We both made choices." Rezekiel made a small, strangled noise that sounded suspiciously like, "Oh, this is getting good." Valthorian's gaze flickered. Because there it was again. That crack, and that flash of steel under the chaos. Up close. Too close. He could see the moment it hit her. The memory, her father, the broken alliance, the 3 years of being left behind. Her expression didn't crumble. Zimriel Thistledoom did not crumble. But something in her eyes went briefly, quietly raw. Valthorian noticed. Of course he did, because apparently his week now included unwanted emotional awareness. She recovered fast. Dangerously fast. Her grin snapped back into place like a weapon being drawn. "Well," she said briskly, clapping once, "this is awkward but survivable." Valthorian blinked slowly. Survivable. "Yes," she said brightly, "emotionally inconvenient, socially questionable, but survivable." Rezekiel whispered to himself, "She's unbelievable." Valthorian exhaled slowly through his nose, because the situation, objectively, was spiraling. "You are remarkably calm," he observed. Zimriel tilted her head. "Oh, I panicked already, internally, very efficiently." A beat. Then, cheerfully, "Got it out of the way." Valthorian should have been furious, should have been offended, should have been many things. Instead, annoyingly, he was impressed, which was unacceptable. The tension between them snapped tight. Electric, loaded, very much not professional. Zimriel crossed her arms and squinted at him. "So," she said, "are you planning to arrest me, Your Majesty? Or are we going to continue this extremely weird courtship via mutual psychological warfare?" Rezekiel physically choked. Valthorian stared at her. Long. Intent. His wolf, traitorous creature was practically vibrating. Because the problem, the deeply catastrophic problem, was that instead of outrage, instead of humiliation, instead of royal fury, Valthorian Grimvaunt was smiling. Just a little. Just enough. And that was infinitely more dangerous. When the villagers had pretended not to stare. They were staring. The goats were clustered together like a suspicious council of horned advisors. And in the center of it all stood Zimriel Thistledoom and Alpha King Valthorian Grimvaunt of Dravenholm. Locked in eye contact that should have required supervision. "You're a king," she repeated. "Yes." "You're an alpha." "Yes." "You let me barter you for livestock." "Yes." She narrowed her eyes. "That feels like a choice." It was. Silence. Heavy. Uncharged. Rezekiel leaned casually against a barrel and whispered to no one in particular. "This marriage is going to require several witnesses and possibly a medic." No one disagreed. Valthorian straightened, flour still faintly clinging to his sleeve like a reminder of humiliation. "The arrangement between our houses stands," he said evenly. "My mother will not dissolve it." Ah, yes. The Queen, the looming matriarchal force behind this entire disaster. Zimriel's jaw tightened slightly. "So I accidentally kidnapped royalty," she said, "and now we're legally obligated to spend eternity together." "Essentially," she nodded once. "Very efficient of us." Rezekiel coughed to hide a laugh. But here was the problem. The political marriage was no longer theoretical. It wasn't a distant obligation arranged by a dramatic merchant father and a terrifying queen. It was standing in front of her. Tall, annoyingly composed, but looking at her like she was not a problem to be managed, but a decision to be made. Zimriel crossed her arms. "And what happens," she asked lightly, "when my stepmother learns I've accidentally become queen adjacent?" Valthorian's expression shifted. Colder. More deliberate. "Lady Valistra will learn," he said calmly, "that financial predation has consequences." That tone. That was not bakery flour tone. That was crown and courtroom tone. Zimriel blinked. "So you're going to intimidate her?" "I am going to audit her." Rezekiel inhaled sharply. Audits were worse. Somewhere in another kingdom, Lady Valistra Thistledoom felt a sudden chill and did not know why. Step-family threat looming? Oh, absolutely, but no longer one-sided. A loud bleat interrupted the tension. All 5 goats were now pressed against the fence, watching, judging, emotionally invested. One of them stomped. Another attempted to chew Valthorian's cloak again, and he didn't even look down this time. Growth. "They're attached," Zimriel observed. "They are livestock. They have feelings. They have horns." The smallest goat head-butted his boot. Zimriel grinned. "They chose you." Valthorian stared at the horizon like a man reconsidering destiny. "I was not aware I was auditioning." "You were very standable." Rezekiel folded his arms, nodding thoughtfully. "Valthorian Grimvaunt," he murmured, "defeated. Not in battle." A beat. "Aren't in vibes." Valthorian did not dignify that with eye contact, but he did not deny it. The villagers had wisely drifted away. The air between them remained. Electric, unresolved. Zimriel stepped closer, not timid, never timid, but deliberate. "This is absurd," she said quietly. "Yes. You're infuriating. I have been told. You lied to me. I did. And I should be furious. You should." She studied him, searching for arrogance, for mockery, for dismissal. She found none, but only that steady, irritating, unshakable focus. "And instead," she muttered, She stopped. "Absolutely not," Valthorian's voice lowered. "You're what?" Her eyes flashed. "Annoyed." "That is not what you were going to say," she glared. "I was going to say strategically inconvenienced." "That is also not what you were going to say." Rezekiel silently backed away. Self-preservation was a lifestyle. Zimriel exhaled sharply. "This is what happens when people get close," she said. "It gets messy." "Yes. You're very calm about that." "I am not calm." He stepped closer. Too close. Close enough that the space between them felt intentional, controlled, dangerous. "My wolf," he said quietly, "is behaving in a manner I do not appreciate." Her breath hitched, just slightly. "Your wolf needs better hobbies," she replied. "It appears to have chosen one." The air thickened. She swallowed. "You're very certain," she said, "and I am rarely uncertain." "That sounds exhausting." He almost smiled. "It is." A pause. Then, "You do not have to marry me," he said. The words landed. Unexpected. She blinked. "You just said the arrangement stands." "It does." "Then that is contradictory." "I can dissolve it." Silence. The goats stopped bleating. Even they sensed the shift. "You would," she said slowly, "walk away. If you asked." Her pulse betrayed her, because here was the truth. She didn't want him to, and that was the most alarming development of all. Zimriel looked up at him, eyes bright, sharp, a little terrified. "If you think I'm behaving at the wedding," she warned softly, "you've learned nothing." His gaze darkened. "I would be deeply suspicious if you did." Her lips twitched, dangerously. "This is a terrible idea," she murmured. "Yes. We would argue constantly. Yes. You would glare at my furniture. It is poorly arranged. I would reorganize your throne room." His eyes flickered. "You would not." "I absolutely would." Silence, charged, alive. "This is going to end in chaos," she said. "Most worthwhile things do." That hit, harder than she expected, because underneath the pride, underneath the politics, underneath the goats, he wasn't treating her like a liability. He was choosing her, consciously. And that was terrifying. Zimriel squared her shoulders, lifted her chin. Very Omega, very unsupervised. "Fine," she said. Rezekiel perked up immediately. "Fine?" Velthorian repeated. "Fine," she confirmed. "We'll proceed with this mutually disastrous alliance." He studied her carefully. "You are certain?" She smirked. "No." A beat. "But I am curious." That was worse, far worse. Velthorian exhaled slowly. Because here it was. The inevitable, the unavoidable, or the political marriage that had begun as obligation and evolved into something infinitely more dangerous. "This will complicate everything," he said. "Yes." "Your stepfamily will attempt retaliation." "Yes." "The court will question you." "They can form a line." A goat bleated approvingly. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since stepping into that chaotic marketplace. He did not see a problem. He saw a partner, strategic, reckless, bright, unapologetic, but unfortunately, deeply, undeniably compelling. Velthorian Grimvaunt had been defeated, not in battle, in vibes, and Zimriel Thistledoom, who had sworn attachment was suspicious, was already planning how to emotionally survive standing beside him at an altar. This was not calm. This was not reasonable. This was slow-burn disaster wrapped in royal fabric. And as the 5 goats bleated in chaotic approval, the kingdom of Dravenholm had absolutely no idea what was coming. If you had told the court of Dravenholm that their future queen would arrive at her own coronation-adjacent ceremony with 5 goats, a reorganized seating chart, and opinions about curtain symmetry, they would have laughed. They do not laugh anymore. 8 months later, the capital of Dravenholm was immaculate. Banners straight, guards polished, courtiers whispering with professional restraint. And at the center of the palace courtyard stood a raised platform, gilded railings, and an altar that had been inspected no fewer than 6 times by a deeply anxious master of ceremonies. Because today was not merely ceremonial, today was official. The political marriage between the House of Grimvaunt and the late House of Thistledoom would be formally sealed. And yes, there were goats, 5 of them, legally present, emotionally invested. Velthorian Grimvaunt stood at the front in full regalia, crown precise, cloak draped perfectly, expression composed. But he looked every inch the Alpha King of Dravenholm. He also looked like a man who had lost an argument to floral arrangements earlier that morning. "Breathe," murmured Rezekiel beside him. "I am breathing." "You are glaring at the aisle. It is uneven." "It is not. It is emotionally uneven." Rezekiel patted his shoulder. "You married her." A pause. "Technically, yes." At the far end of the courtyard, music shifted. Not delicate, not subtle. A little too dramatic. And because subtlety had long since left this narrative. And then, Zimriel Thistledoom appeared. The murmuring stopped. Not because she was quiet, but because she was radiant. Her gown was elegant, but unmistakably her structured bodice, flowing skirts, embroidered with small silver thistles and, if one looked closely, very tiny goats stitched along the hem. Symbolism matters. Her hair was partially braided, partially rebellious. Her smile? Sharp, soft, certain. She walked like a woman who had once bartered a king and would absolutely do it again if necessary. Behind her, the goats, ribbons tied loosely around their horns, one attempting to eat a flower arrangement. The court did not react. They had adapted. Growth. When she reached the altar, she stopped in front of Valthorion, looked up at him, tilted her head. "You look very royal," she observed. "You look very disruptive." "Thank you." A pause. Then, more softly, "You're still certain?" His gaze steadied. "Entirely." Her grin softened. "Just a little." Good. It had not been an easy 8 months. The stepfamily had attempted 3 separate social offensives and one deeply ill-advised financial maneuver. Lady Valistra had discovered, too late, that royal audits were not rumors. They were experiences. Unpleasant ones. The court had questioned Zimriel's lack of restraint. She had responded by improving trade routes, restructuring grain distribution, and personally negotiating 2 new merchant alliances. Efficiency is persuasive. The whispers had quieted. Respect had replaced them. Slowly, deliberately, earned. And through it all, Valthorion had watched her, learned her rhythms, learned when she joked because she was nervous, learned when she grew still because something hurt. She learned him too, learned the subtle tells of his wolf, learned the difference between controlled silence and overwhelmed silence. It had learned that he liked his tea strong, his papers organized, and his hand held when no one was looking. Back in the courtyard, the officiant cleared his throat. Rezekiel prepared emotionally. The goats shuffled closer. "This marriage," the officiant began carefully, "unites 2 houses in alliance and—" A goat bleated loudly. The officiant paused. Adjusted. "And mutual prosperity." Zimriel squeezed Valthorion's hand. Barely noticeable. He squeezed back. Not subtle at all. Vows were spoken, and measured from him, unexpectedly warm from her. When it came time for final confirmation, she leaned closer and whispered, "If you think I'm behaving after this, you've learned nothing." His mouth curved. "I would be concerned if you did." The officiant declared them bound. The courtyard erupted. Applause, relieved nobles, one very enthusiastic goat. Valthorion turned to her. Not as king, not as strategist, just as a man who had once walked into a bakery and never recovered. "You traded me," he murmured. "You were very sellable. And now?" She smiled. Soft this time, no mask. "No refunds." He laughed, actually laughed. The court stared. History was being rewritten. Valthorion Grimvaunt had been defeated, not in battle, in vibes, and he had never been more satisfied with the outcome. Later, as twilight settled over Dravenholm, they stood alone on a palace balcony, the city below glowing. Alive. "Ours," his wolf supplied quietly. "Ours," she corrected, when Zimriel leaned against the railing. "You know," she said thoughtfully, 8 months ago you were covered in flour." "Yes. And I had no money." "Yes. And we were arguing about goats." "Yes." She glanced at him. "And now?" He stepped closer, slid an arm around her waist. Now familiar. Now easy. "Now," he said quietly, We are arguing about curtain symmetry in a palace. She snorted. The curtains are emotionally uneven. They are not. They absolutely are. A beat. Comfortable. Warm. And below them, one of the goats bleated from the royal gardens. They both looked over the edge. It had somehow gotten past 3 guards. Zimriella grinned. Family? She said. Valthorion exhaled slowly. Resigned. Fond. Yes. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Gentle. Unobserved. I am glad, he said softly, that you did not trade me again. She leaned into him. For the record, she replied, you're worth at least 7 now. He smiled against her hair. I will take that. The kingdom slept peacefully that night, its king content, its queen unrepentant. And in the royal gardens, 5 goats grazed beneath the moonlight, victorious.